Now, perhaps a better title for this video would have been Why Do So Many Games Fail? Because I think there is an element of oversaturation in the games market right now. You look at the new releases on Steam every day, and there are just games after games after games getting pumped into the market with not enough people to actually play them, let alone buy them. But what I want to talk about in this video is why do so many free-to-play games fail? Specifically, I think maybe that's not quite the right way of phrasing it, but what I'm really looking at is why have there been so few big impact free-to-play games since about 2016? Or 2012, if you want to go even further back to look at some of even the top 10. Why are so many games struggling to take market share away from free-to-play games that kind of came out between 2007 and 2016, like a golden era for free-to-play game launches? That's not to say there weren't failures of free-to-play games in those eras as well. Trust me, the thumbnail includes many games that were released in that window. But if you look at the top 10 played games in the world right now, a lot of them are just free-to-play titles that have existed for about 15 years. It was this tweet here that inspired this entire video. If you don't work in the games marketing space, you probably don't know who Ryan Rigney is, but he's an incredibly accomplished and very well-respected games marketer, currently at the helm of Play Odyssey, who have produced games like Mega Strikers. And I really respect Ryan. He has a really great newsletter, and he just basically put out a pretty thought-provoking tweet. How many successful free-to-play games from the West have there been in the last half-decade? Now, he mentions Apex and Valorant, obviously two big titles that have done pretty well recently, and obviously a lot of Asian game development teams have done incredible things with things like Naraka and Lost Ark. They tend to be able to cater to the free-to-play market a little bit better. But the premise of the tweet was interesting because it just so happens that during my MBA, I did a lot of my essays on game development topics and games marketing topics. And one of the topics that I chose to cover was the free-to-play market. And speaking of great free-to-play games, you guys need to come and join me on Raid Shadow Legends. I have a clan and there's no one in it. Please come and join me. I need help. I really do need the help. There's 2 guys haven't logged in 4 days. You need to come and save me. Raid Shadow Legends. Thank you to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video. I'm loving Raid, by the way. Genuinely. 6 years old game, and I'm absolutely loving it. There's so much depth. There's so much customization. I love searching for the perfect piece of loot for my heroes. It's just absolutely amazing. So please, please, please do come and join me using my link. You're going to get 2 free heroes, 2 free epic heroes if you use my link. So you're going to get Rector Drath and Tyrell by using my QR code or my link in the description below. 2 insane support heroes that are really good, especially Rector Drath. Really good. I don't even have it on my account. I didn't use my own link to download the game. I'm an idiot. Make sure you don't make that mistake as well. Additionally, if you want to see me play some raid content, kind of figure out how to play the game, especially from a new player perspective like me, doing some content on my second channel, make sure you come and check it out. I'm going to try and make my integrations like this really stupid all the time just because I have fun with it. But yeah, please download the game using my link. Also come and check out my content on my second channel, all of which the links are in the description below. Let's jump straight back into the video. I want to talk a little bit about the types of free-to-play games that exist because it does define how we measure success with them. I am going to be primarily looking at player base count in terms of defining success for a game. However, there are plenty of free-to-play games out there that have small player bases but are financially successful. We'll talk about that in a minute though. The first big category of free-to-play games, and I consider there to be 3 main big categories of free-to-play games, but the first big category is free-to-play with purchasable options that are cosmetic or non-game altering only. So this is a competitive game, most of the time, that a free-to-play player and a paying player will always be on a completely even keel. These are the types of games that are usually most well received by players, but also the types of games that require absolutely massive player bases in order to sustain themselves from a financial point of view for the long term. The biggest example of this, as most of you will probably know, is League of Legends. Free to play, at the point of access, and only sells cosmetics. These cosmetics, you can argue that some skins give a slight visual clarity advantage, but ultimately you're looking at a relatively even playing field from anybody that has never played the game, never spent in the game, to anybody that has spent tens of thousands on skins. Like, you're not getting an inherent game advantage by having skins for the most part. An example of a game that did this but that didn't succeed was Vainglory. In fact, Vainglory was way too generous. They let you grind and achieve skins in the game, any skin that you wanted realistically, simply by playing. But they didn't build a big enough player base to sustain themselves financially in the long term. You really do need a very big player base in this category of free-to-play games to make it work. The next category of free-to-play games are the ones that you would consider pay-to-win. These are the types of games that you're free to play at the point of access, but you are gated as a free-to-play player either by time, you need to spend a lot of time to catch up to those that would pay, or you are simply completely blocked off from getting certain items or upgrades if you are unwilling to spend. Now, these games are usually mobile. They do exist on the PC market, but they are the audience is much less receptive to these types of games on the PC market, so they tend to dominate the mobile space. Examples of this are games like Clash of Clans and Clash Royale. Supercell is the absolute king of creating free-to-play games that have pay-to-win elements that encourage users to spend to keep up with the competition. Clash of Clans and Clash Royale are entirely PvP games, and if you were spending, or at least Clash of Clans had a little bit of a PvE thing, but it was primarily PvP. If you were spending in these games within the first year, you were getting massive advantages over your competition that were not paying in the games. And obviously, once your customer base had reached the max, they started to introduce new mechanics and new things that you could pay for. Equipment in Clash of Clans and evolutions in Clash Royale. There was always a way to keep encouraging spending, and these types of games do not need massive player bases to be financially successful. You just need a certain percentage of your user base to spend, and then an even smaller percentage of that paying user base to be the mega whales, the people that spend a lot of money. That's not to say that the free-to-play audience aren't important in these games. They are. The whales need to have free-to-play players to dunk on. Otherwise, how else would they feel like they're getting an advantage by spending in-game? But comparative to the cosmetic-only types of games, these games can sustain themselves rather on a smaller player base, which allows you to be successful without the need to capture large areas of the market. The last type of game that I want to talk about is the free-to-play game that offers DLC. So you get access to a base game from a free-to-play perspective, but there are plenty of attractive things offered to you that you would like to purchase because they unlock more in the game. They give you new features, new items, new cosmetics, and this is another type of model that generally can be applied to the PC market. It doesn't always exist in the mobile market because they often tend to be like PvE games where you are purely just playing it for your own enjoyment, and if you would like to unlock more things, you can do. A good example of this is The Sims 4. The base Sims 4 game is free to play, but there are plenty of add-ons and plenty of DLCs that cost a lot of money, and usually these are things like new items, new cosmetic packs, new areas in the game, all those kind of stuff. And generally people who like Sims like to have the customization options to create whatever house or whatever setup they want, and therefore having the extra options available to them is attractive. And that's where these free-to-play games tend to work. And again, they don't necessarily need massive player bases to be successful. They can generally make a lot of revenue per person. Because there's just a lot of things that people want to end up purchasing. So again, another type of free-to-play game that doesn't necessarily need a massive audience share to end up being financially successful. Free-to-play games really kind of popped up from the late 90s all the way through the 2000s, gaining a lot of momentum around the 2010 mark. Now, those of you who are old as me, you'll recognize that free-to-play games, especially free-to-play browser games, they were around in the early 2000s. There was so many random flash games, even like big MMOs like MapleStory and RuneScape, that allowed you to play on a free-to-play basis. This is not something that magically sprung up with the likes of Dota 2 or even League of Legends. This model had been tested. It wasn't always successful, but it had been tested, and it had been proven that it can work as a viable way to develop and release a game. You just had to have something that the audience felt that they was worth paying for. In RuneScape, that was gating a load of content behind membership. Whereas in the likes of League of Legends, that was offering very high quality premium cosmetic items that people wanted to buy. I want to take a look at some of the charts for mobile games and for PC games. Take a look at the current, as of today, August 20th, my birthday, by the way. Yes, I'm making a video on my birthday. I am just that sad. Take a look at the top free-to-play games in terms of current players. And you're going to notice something rather interesting. The ones that have stood the test of time, they came out in 2013. Now, some people confuse Dota 2 Early Access, the paid Early Access for Dota 2, as being releasing as a non-free-to-play title. It was always designed as a free-to-play title. So, Dota 2, 2013. Path of Exile, 2013. Team Fortress 2, 2007, but went free-to-play in 2011. War Thunder, 2013. Warframe, 2013. Now, this isn't a coincidence. What I'm going to show you in a minute is really quite interesting, because we're going to look at some Steam charts, and we're also going to have a look at general game releases too. But we're going to have a look specifically at Steam, because I'm using this as a benchmark. Steam is the most popular games platform for PC in the world, and I'm obviously comparing it to what I've just shown you in terms of the most played games, right? Let's take a look at the Steam free-to-play game releases by month and year, dating all the way back to 2006. So I'm going to show you from Steam's database the Steam game releases by month, but specifically I want to look at it from 2006 to 2024. I mean, Steam was not releasing a huge number of games pre-2014, and in 2014 it exploded. Now, there are several reasons for that. I'm going to show you another graph in a minute that just shows you how much the game industry has expanded in general, but ultimately Steam also started letting more people publish on the platform, made it more accessible to way more devs, and as you can see, we are just on an upward trajectory of number of games being released on Steam per month, which is crazy. I mean, this is just, these little data points are per month. It's insane how many games are releasing on Steam. I'm going to quickly show you another statistic now that will also help you understand exactly why this sort of, I guess, this trend is happening. So you can see that from 2014 onwards, gaming revenue has exploded, but specifically in the mobile space. But it has gone on an upward trajectory in the console and PC space as well. It took a little dip around 2019 and then went all the way back up again. And you can see that video game revenue has continued to rise. Now, this is probably not a sustainable rise in video game revenue, but if there is money to be made, more games will be made as well. It is a meteoric rise in overall industry revenue. And that's probably also explains why there are more game development studios creating more games, releasing more games. They just want a chunk of that change. So this is a different graph. This is the number of games released that are free to play on Steam. Now, obviously, it mirrors the kind of general game release cadence that we had on Steam. Steam, quite candidly became far more popular from 2013, 2014 onwards, and they made it more accessible. As we've said, practically anyone can publish a game on Steam now. That didn't always used to be the case. But I want to highlight that when we look back at that list that we just saw a few minutes ago of the most concurrently played games on Steam that are free to play, a huge bulk of them came out in 2013, where there really wasn't many free to play games releasing at all. And that to me says two things. First movers advantage in a free-to-play category is a huge deal. When free-to-play games were starting to gain popularity in that sort of 2007 to 2014 to 16 range, people that were releasing a free-to-play title that was very polished and very, very exciting for consumers were able to essentially claw a huge market share. Like they got their claws into a massive market share of players. And that means that being a first mover in your free-to-play category is an inherent advantage. Secondly, and we're going to talk about some business theory in a moment, and I know that sounds boring, but trust me, it is quite interesting in this context. But traditionally, when you're a first mover, there are some inherent disadvantages, especially when you're looking at a physical product. The inherent disadvantages are people can copy you, people can build on your product and make it better, and essentially it can be harder for you to respond to a quickly adapted market. Because we have had a rise in this same era of live service games, and live service games are games that are continuously updated with new content being brought even 10, 15 years after the game's release. Look at League of Legends, for example. Plenty of new content still coming for that game. Live service games inherently wipe out some of the follower advantages, because essentially, as a first mover, you can do the same thing. You can essentially update your game and respond to market demands very quickly. A really good example of this is the rise in the auto battler genre. So there was a mod for Dota 2 called Auto Chess that became inherently very popular. And as a result of that, there were lots of copycats that picked up, but specifically copycats coming from games that were live service games. Obviously, the most successful of all of those was Teamfight Tactics. Teamfight Tactics has been a success story for Riot, and it was essentially something that they were able to do because the League of Legends game is a live service game, and they were able to bring a massive new game mode with a very relatively short turnaround time and capitalize on the success of the changing market demands in terms of a type of game that was interesting. Dota 2 obviously went down a completely separate game, but they probably could have integrated it into their main game if they really wanted to. I mean, that's kind of what the Auto Chess mod was in the first place. So that's just an example of, follower and first mover advantages, and how a live service game can erode some of the follower advantages that you traditionally have. All right, here's where the video is going to get a little bit off topic, but trust me, go with it. It's important. We're going to talk a little bit about some marketing terminology, specifically, as I've just mentioned, first movers and followers. It's important that we talk about this because it's going to give you some context as to why certain titles have remained dominant for so long. And I'm going to give you some examples of real world first movers. What am I talking about? Real world, like games are real world. Non-gaming real world examples of followers and first movers, and ones where followers had the advantage and ones where first movers had the advantage. And then I'm going to obviously extrapolate that and talk a little bit about why this matters to free-to-play games. We're going to go through the advantages and disadvantages of being a first mover. And as such, that will tell you a bit more about the advantages of being a follower and then the disadvantages of being a follower. So it's pretty obvious with first movers. Like, essentially, with first movers, especially if you've identified a sizable market, if you're the first to bring a product to that market, there is a good opportunity for you to capture that market in its entirety, in the sense that you're bringing a product with no competition, and depending on the scope of the market, if it is a genuine need, and the consumers genuinely want this product, then you can essentially just dominate from the very get-go. And by doing so, you're building switching costs for the consumer. Switching costs can mean a lot of things. It could mean that, let's say, you're an espresso coffee machine and you have allowed customers to build up hordes of the Nespresso pods. If something else came out to contest that, and there are machines that do contest Nespresso, it's difficult for them to switch because they'll probably want to work their way through their existing Nespresso pods. Some of them might have it on subscription, and it just becomes a pain in the bum. You've worked with that for so long, consumers aren't interested in having to find something alternative. And to really convince a consumer to switch, the alternative has to be that much better. It not only needs to be a little bit better, it needs to be a lot better, because there is a cost of switching associated. You need to convince the customer that the money that they've spent potentially over a long period of time on this product, the new offering is just that much better, which is why you'll often see businesses iterate on their own product that uses the same types of materials so they can bring those advantages to their customer base whilst basically almost lowering or making the cost of switching non-existent. Talking about some disadvantages now. The product can be copied. So when you are first to come to a market, you then put your product on display for everybody. That essentially reduces R&D costs for all of your competitors on the market. Your product then has its flaws, its bonuses, its everything on display, and competitors can look to one-up you. And depending on how fast they can move, if they are quick to follow, they can be disruptive, and they can capitalize on your market share before you're able to put a foothold in that market and build up those switching costs. So if you have a very fast follower that can build a product very quickly and get into market within months, whilst you haven't had the opportunity to establish yourself as the dominant brand in that space, that's where you can get caught out as a first mover. It's a high cost to sustain. You need to continuously market. You need to market aggressively when competitors come into that market. You then have to build on brand and all that kind of stuff on top of it. Depending on the type of product you are, it can be difficult to adapt in a fast-paced market. If you're a physical product, to adapt when consumers have rapidly changing needs, you have to go back and design a whole other product. And that's difficult. And also, more importantly, especially when you are a genuinely new product, you have to be the explainer. You have to put the work in your marketing materials to explain what your product is and how to use it and why it's necessary in the first place. By doing that, you build up an inherent amount of knowledge within your consumers, which is great because that makes your product more appealing, but it also makes the product in general more appealing. So if you are the explainer, it means that everybody that follows no longer needs to explain. They don't need to put any resources into explaining because everybody already knows how to use that product. A good example of a first mover versus a follower battle is Pandora versus Spotify. If anybody knows what Pandora is, I congratulate you. It's not known by everybody, but it was one of the first online music streaming platforms. Spotify, most of you will know, is probably the most dominant brand in the online music streaming space. Pandora was released in 2005. Spotify wasn't officially released until 2008, giving Pandora a 3-year advantage in terms of trying to capture the online market. Now, the early 2000s were a weird time. People had just moved over to MP3 players from like CDs, and this is a whole new thing in terms of online streaming. Pandora initially was a personalized radio platform. There was not on-demand streaming. You basically picked a genre of radio station that you liked, and you would get songs given to you that were from that genre that you might like. But there wasn't a kind of an on-demand, I want to choose this artist with this song and stream that over and over again or build a playlist. Spotify, however, did that. Now, there was a big reason why this happened. The reason is that Pandora fought music labels for the royalties. They fought them tooth and nail for prices and sort of licensing fees and all that kind of good stuff. Spotify, however, just said, yeah, F it. We will take what you want. We just want your music on the platform. Now, there was a lot of legal jargon that happened with Spotify afterwards, where they refused to pay and went to court battles. But what Spotify did was quite clever in that respect. By getting the music onto their platform, even with the potentially false promise of paying out to the music labels, they built up a massive consumer base to the point at which, when it became apparent that the labels could not actually live without Spotify, because Spotify was one of the biggest ways to distribute their music to the people that were listening to it, it put Spotify in a much more advantageous position to negotiate. Pandora, however, were very late to catch up and were not able to get to on-demand streaming until Spotify had kind of already cornered that market. This is an example where Spotify was able to see what Pandora was doing and iterate on it, and bringing out their own product that was superior and met consumers' needs in a better fashion. Another good example of a first mover versus a follower in the physical product space is the Nespresso Pod coffee machine. They were the first to market with this new innovative way of delivering a high quality coffee to a consumer without the need for very expensive and often quite complicated equipment. They simplified the coffee making process whilst also making the user feel like they were getting something much higher quality than a basic filter coffee. It was a very, very well-designed product, and they did a lot of things right. They immediately positioned themselves as a premium product, that even if they were to face competition, they would always be seen as the absolute pinnacle. They taught consumers how to use the product, and they built up a lot of brand equity. Nespresso used George Clooney and lots of other big figures to kind of allow themselves to capture a market audience and really get them to buy in. And even though their market share has been eroded because there are just lots and lots and lots of followers now, like there are brands all over the place that do this kind of thing, they still maintain the top market share in terms of this type of product. So obviously the followers had advantages in terms of, seeing how it was done, trying to one-up it, trying to better it. But Nespresso brought a product out that was very difficult to iterate on. Now, in 2012, the patents expired and you started getting loads of copycats. And ultimately, there are things that you can do as a follower that will allow you to make yourself more attractive than Nespresso. For instance, a lot of them targeted the price point. A lot of the competitors kind of came out with cheaper versions. The capsules were cheaper, and they tried to target them from that angle. But ultimately, Nespresso has still maintained its market share, despite being the first product in the market of its kind, despite the increased competition from a multitude of coffee competitors. They have maintained that market share. And that's just by being strong with flavors of coffee, strong with R&D, adapting well, but also specifically creating a quite high barrier for switching. So the cost of switching is quite high. Nespresso tend to offer very large volumes of pods for cheap. And so it often means that you can buy a massive amount of pods for a very, very good price. And often you're left with loads and loads of pods. So to get through those pods, to switch to another coffee machine, you'd have to get through those pods so you don't waste them. You need to buy a new coffee machine and buy separate pods that don't work with Nespresso, and it becomes a pain. Not only that, Nespresso offers subscription services for pods, which means that on a monthly basis, you're just getting those pods over and over again without having to think. And that even more so creates a barrier for switching because you're just getting them over and over again. And if you forget about the subscription, you are ultimately going to have to get through those pods before you can switch. So they did a pretty good job of making it difficult to switch to another product and have, as a result, maintained a very strong market share. So why am I talking about coffee machines and live streaming services when we're really here to talk about games? Well, I need to add the caveat that free-to-play games primarily exist in the live service space. Free-to-play games are designed to be multiplayer. They're designed to be continuously updated. And this is just something that is really there across all live service games. But being a first mover in a live service category kind of removes quite a few of the disadvantages of being a first mover. Your product can be very easily updated. It can be quite easy to adapt in a fast-paced market. And even if your product can be copied, you can essentially perform the upgrades that your copies might do very quickly as well. In relative speaking terms, I'm not saying devs can just churn out an update within days, but what I'm saying is that, you do not need to go back to R&D, you do not need to go back to physical product development and put a product through a rigorous testing process. No, in live service games, you can make relatively easy, very low cost to deploy updates to your product that can essentially fix any issues that your competitors might identify or that you find out down the line. Meaning that if you are first to market, you build up brand recognition, you have no competition, you build up switching costs for consumers as a live service, free-to-play game. There is essentially very few downsides. Yes, you might need to spend more on marketing, but then your competitors are going to need to spend a lot more on marketing to compete with you in the first place. And yes, you had to be the explainer, but by being the explainer, you've built a certain amount of affinity with your target audience. They consider you kind of like the OG. And as long as you continuously remove the competitive edge of your competitors by keeping up in pace of the market, very few of your competitors are going to build such an advantage where users feel like it's worth switching. A good example of this, right, was, let's remove Honor of Kings from the equation because that was China only for a very long time. But let's talk about Mobile Legends versus Wild Rift. Mobile Legends was the first to market in a big sense. There were a few others. There were a couple of MOBAs floating around at the time that were mobile based, but Mobile Legends was the first kind of successful first mover in the space. And it built up a massive brand recognition, a huge audience across Southeast Asia, and actually a decent audience on the global market as well. And as a live service game, they shamelessly copied what worked for other titles. if another title was gaining traction by having a feature that Mobile Legends could have had, Mobile Legends added it because they wanted to keep pace and make sure that their game was as competitive as possible. By the time that probably the biggest, and I wouldn't call them a fast follower, they were quite a slow follower, but the biggest kind of brand competitor came into the space in terms of Wild Rift, the cost for switching for Mobile Legends users to a product that may have been considered superior, and if you look at it from a baseline point of view, the graphic fidelity, the controls, the overall architecture of Wild Rift, it was just better than Mobile Legends, but no one wanted to switch. Why was that? And that is really one of the biggest things, and this is one of the things that I call, but this is what to tie you all the way back to the free-to-play conundrum. It's the biggest things that mean that free-to-play titles very rarely, especially if they're competing in a genre where free-to-play titles already exist, free-to-play titles very rarely do well in this era. This is a pretty good time to quickly touch on some of the highest grossing games in video game history. And this is from a website called Video Game Sales Wiki. And, there's references for each of them. I'm going to assume that some of these figures are out, but it's a pretty good list. And we can kind of talk about some of the key points here. There's a really, really good tangent I could go on about Space Invaders and Pac-Man being first movers in terms of actual video games, but let's not go down that rabbit hole because it'll take us forever. What I want to look at here is games that we know are free to play and are in the top 20 or top 15 of lifetime revenue. Honor of Kings, free-to-play mobile game, released primarily in China, went global this year, top 6. Fortnite, released in 2017 as a free-to-play, and has been now in the top 5 of all-time revenues. And that's obviously, let's take away inflation, for instance, because obviously a lot of these guys are adjusting for inflation. But, Fortnite, free-to-play, one of the top grossing games of all time. League of Legends, 2009, one of the top grossing games of all time. Crossfire, ashamed I haven't mentioned Crossfire already. Free-to-play FPS, primarily successful in the Asian market, but ultimately top 10 highest grossing games of all time. Candy Crush Saga, one of the most casual free-to-play mobile titles that ever was released. Came out in 2012, one of the most highest grossing games of all time. Pokemon Go, free-to-play, one of the highest grossing games of all time. I could go on here, but you're seeing it. These games have been able to retain success and gross a huge amount of profit. And if you look at this list, there is nothing in this top 10 list that has come out after 2017. I know 2017 is now, believe it or not, 7 years ago. You're not seeing any recent games in the last 5 years in this list. In fact, if you go further down this list, one of the most recent games is actually Genshin Impact. But on the top 20, there is nothing that is more recent than Genshin Impact in terms of overall revenue. Now, ultimately, what we can say here is these games have had a lot of time to generate that revenue, but it only adds to the fact that these games have retained and sustained their position in the market. And that's also the case for player numbers. If we have a look at a random figure of player numbers, and you can kind of compare it to the grossing numbers. I'm going to look at the player numbers as recently as I can get them, and we can kind of compare it to the revenue generated, because it tells a pretty similar story. All right, so I'm going to show you this very quickly because I want to compare it to the previous set of data we looked at, but this is Newzoo. So Newzoo is a very well-respected gaming data platform, kind of collects data about gamers and interests and habits, blah, 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 blah. But the most important thing here is we're looking at their July 2024 most played PC game list by monthly active user. Top 2, Minecraft and Roblox. Roblox is a free-to-play game. Fortnite, as you can see, still in the top 3. The Sims 4, we talked about it earlier, that has risen 14 places at 4. Counter-Strike 2, technically free to play. I think if you had Counter-Strike Go, I actually don't know if you're getting into Counter-Strike now, whether it's straight up free to play or whether you need to buy it. League of Legends, number 6, still in the top 6. Valorant, obviously free to play, but a more recent release. That is obviously helped out by the fact that Riot's Behemoth brand released this. Grand Theft Auto 5 still there, but that was a paid game. Having a look down the list, Apex Legends, free to play, and that has still retained its position. And Once Human is the only other new addition to the top 20 list here. So Once Human is probably the newest addition, but I don't anticipate that the Once Human player count is going to stay that high. But nonetheless, you're seeing those games that have had the highest grossing revenue over time are still in the top 10 most played games in the world. And that is, for the case of League of Legends, that's 15 years ago. And it's still in the top 6 most played games by monthly active users worldwide. And as a quick follow-up to that, here are the 2024 highest grossing mobile games. Honor of Kings, which you saw on that list, came out in 2015. Monopoly Go is one of the newer additions to the free-to-play market, but it was ultimately building on a well-established brand. I will add that. Monopoly Go was Monopoly. Monopoly's been out for years. It's not like it was creating something completely new. A little bit like Valorant, had a little bit of brand help to establish itself. PUBG Mobile has been out for years. Roblox, Candy Crush Saga on that list came out years ago and is still in 2024 some of the highest grossing mobile games. And those of you that may have looked at some other statistics might know that I think Subway Surfers is still one of the most downloaded games of all time and has been every year. And that game has been out since bloody the App Store was opened. So like games that released as a free to play very early on, they have captured and sustained themselves in the market. Interestingly enough, there are a couple of new additions to the 2024 highest grossing, like Honkai, that came out relatively recently. That's a competitor to Genshin. But ultimately, you're seeing big names here that are sticky, and they're not going anywhere, and they're still continuing to generate massive amounts of revenue. Now, ultimately, I could have made this game about why do most games fail, because live service games in general have done this to the market. But there have been new releases that have done incredibly well that are paid one-shot releases like Baldur's Gate 3, Black Myth Wukong, Elden Ring. There are still incredibly successful games that do not demand a consistent investment for you to enjoy them. And I think that's the key separator here. You have games that are still doing incredibly well that are games that respect your time for the investment that you make. I buy Elden Ring, I spend as much time as I want in Elden Ring, and I don't feel like I have to go back to it once I've completed it. Same with Baldur's Gate, you do a playthrough. Lots of people like to do multiple playthroughs in Baldur's Gate 3, but for your average gamer, you do a playthrough of the story, you get your money's worth, and you're happy to leave it at that. So why is it that free-to-play games in general do not do well? Or as well as they were doing back in the day. And here it is. For a free-to-play game to be successful, it needs to be live service. You cannot have a free-to-play game that is a one-shot like Baldur's Gate or Black Myth Wukong, because ultimately people would play it and never come back. And you've got to remember that the majority of people that pick up free-to-play games are free to play. They don't spend. So if you give them a playthrough experience that they can enjoy at its fullest for free, you're not going to make any money, because once they've done it and the playthrough has happened, they ain't coming back. And that's the big thing that you need to be aware of. And the whole point of this video, why it's focused on free-to-play in general, is because free-to-play games need to be live service. And a problem as a follower in live service is that you need to do something very special, very, very special to convince people to move over. So let's explore it. The free-to-play games barriers for switching. And that is the biggest thing that free-to-play games that released earlier and were first movers have managed to build as massive advantages for themselves. Here are some pretty good examples. Time spent by the player. Really, time spent is the number one thing, because time spent also includes free-to-play players. Because ultimately, you would think that if a player has spent no money in a game, that they would be more tempted to switch. And that is technically true. There is definitely less of an incentive to stick with a game if you haven't spent any money on it. It doesn't feel like you're losing much. But the time spent is actually a big deal, because it leads to lots of other things that come attached with spending time in the game. Things like social groups and cliques. You've built friend groups that play this game. And I'm going to kick myself for saying this, but I don't mean it as a meme. There is a genuine sense of pride and accomplishment for achieving certain milestones and ranks. And that comes along with online status and social positioning. If you're a high rank in League of Legends, you're respected in certain groups. To an extent, there's a little bit of trolling that goes on in League of Legends communities online, but ultimately, if you are a high rank in a game, you generally tend to command a certain sense of respect amongst that game's community, and that can be hard to leave behind. And of course, there's also the content creation aspect. You know, you might be looking to become a content creator or put time into a game to essentially make it your full-time thing. I mean, lots of people want to be YouTubers, for instance. So the time leads to all of these other things that build up barriers for wanting to switch away. And it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If everybody feels that way, then more people play the game, and therefore it's more likely that you'll make friends that play the game. It's more likely that you'll join social groups that play the game. It's more likely that you'll find communities that will respect you for being a high rank or have a lot of expertise in that particular game. And then, of course, there is the microtransaction-driven economy, where you are literally having spent like thousands potentially in that game over a number of years. I went and had a look at how much I'd spent on League of Legends since I started playing, and that was about 7 years into my playthrough, and I'd spent like 1,500 on skins. And you think, would you ever upfront pay £1,500 for a game? Of course you bloody wouldn't. And that can be quite a mental barrier as well. We're talking, like, essentially you're looking at free-to-play games as a sunk cost fallacy. Like, you can't exit because you've spent too much time and too much money potentially in that game. And that is why it is near impossible to get players to switch willingly from a free-to-play game that they've spent so much time and money in, unless it is extremely good and offers something extremely new. And that's why it's much easier to get these players that are playing free-to-play games consistently to go and do a one-shot game like Baldur's Gate or Black Myth Wukong, because it can offer a break from their free-to-play game. They have no need to come back to it, and it's not going to compete with their time for very long. And once they're done with it, they'll just go back to that free-to-play game that they were playing originally. And so here we can answer the question. Why do so many free-to-play games fail? The reason is simple. They were too late to market. And the free-to-play games that were in the market in that 2007 to 2016 era were able to capture huge chunks of the gaming audience worldwide. I mean, there is only a certain amount of gamers worldwide that you can appeal to. They were able to capture huge chunks of that gaming market and have kind of reeled them in, spending time on the game over a number of years, small successive spends equaling a large amount spent over a number of years. We're talking like both time and money, sunk cost fallacy, building social groups around the games, having an online status associated with the games, either be it, just a social media status, being on a high rank, or, content creation or other kind of game-related career pathways. And that has resulted in it very difficult to break audience members away. Games that have been successful in doing so have been games that allow audience members to jump in, enjoy the game to its fullest, and then never touch it again. These kind of one-pay games like Elden Ring, the new Black Wukong game that came out, Baldur's Gate, those types of games where you can play through at your own pace, you play it once, you probably never play it again. I know it's not the case always with Elden Ring and things like that, but realistically, I'm talking about pay-to-play games are kind of making a comeback because people want something to do alongside the game that they've been playing free-to-play for years. And the free-to-play games that have been releasing have very rarely done anything different. The two biggest examples of free-to-play games, not just in the Western market, that have done incredibly well and have done something very different have been, things like Apex Legends and things like Genshin. I think Valorant was afforded its success because of Riot, and it kind of built on the first-person shooter round-based genre by adding in a lot of hero-based shooter, mechanics. It's like a baby of Counter-Strike and Overwatch. But like a lot of these games are not doing enough different to entice audiences away from the games that they've spent so long in and so much money in over time and have built entire friendship groups around. There's just not enough being done by new titles to bring people away from those that exist. And you will not have any free-to-play games that base their model on gaining very large volumes of audience be successful until there is one of them that does something so different and so unique that people are willing to break a lot of those very deep ties to those previous titles to go and play.